Well, thank you very much for this wonderful opportunity to come and talk to you today. I'll just move this out of the way before I fall and crash. It's an absolute pleasure to be able to come and talk to you today, and I thank Ergotron for their wonderful invitation. I also thank particularly Carrie and Jane for their kind hospitality over the last, well, I've only been here since Sunday, so the last few days. Very much appreciated. My topic is a very long topic, but I thought I should provide a background to this whole sitting disease issue and start to join some of the scientific dots. And I'm a scientist, so we actually have to do the rigorous research so that it can be utilised in such advertising for similar devices like this. But what I'm going to do is, in the next hour, I'm going to spend the next hour talking about nearly 12 years of research. So we talk about 30 years in smoking. This is already 12 years in the making, this research. And I'm going to devote the presentation 50% to talk about our state of knowledge. What do we know at the moment about sedentary behaviour as a unique health problem? And this is a major paradigm shift in thinking. And then I'm going to talk about some of the recent evidence linking sedentary behaviour to mortality. And the important point, even in people who are physically active, we're seeing these relationships. But then, for the second half of the presentation, I want to focus on the real interesting parts, and that's what is our current future and future research directions towards building the evidence base in relation to sitting, and in particular, reduction in sitting, through controlled laboratory studies that we're undertaking, and also through settings-based interventions, and that's what you're probably wishing to hear, and that's about the workplace-type interventions. So, before I start, I acknowledge that I don't do this work in isolation. I have a host of people who I work closely with at my own institute, and we also work very closely with people up in Brisbane. For those that don't know, Brisbane is a 2-hour flight from Melbourne, but we still manage to have a highly productive collaboration via telephone and Skype, etc. And of course, my funding agencies, and I also again acknowledge Ergotron for their kind hospitality over the last few days. I also thought it would be good to just show you who the Australian sedentary behaviour team is and where they are situated, because often we sit down under and a bit forgotten down under. But basically, I work in Melbourne at the Baker IDI Heart and Diabetes Institute, and I'm very fortunate to work very closely with Professor Neville Owen, who is essentially my mentor, has been engaged in physical activity research for the last 40 years and is a real key player in driving this science of sedentary behaviour. And as I mentioned, we have our Brisbane group up in the University of Queensland, Professor Elizabeth Eakin and Dr. Genevieve Healy. Genevieve was a PhD student of ours, Neville and myself, and is now a postdoctoral fellow. And for those that have read the literature, would know that Genevieve has been a major player in a lot of this research. So that's our team, and we work very closely together. So, by way of background, and I'm sure I don't need to talk too much about this because this audience would be well aware of this, in that in the last few decades we've seen significant shifts across the various domains of transportation, domestic and work, whereby essentially we're minimising our muscular activity. And you use some of the examples. In transportation, we've got the heavy reliance on the automobile nowadays, and our housing is highly conducive to automobile transportation as opposed to public transport that used to exist in previous decades. And I remember I used to stay out at the front yard until it got dark, playing in the front yard. Now we have a lot of these sedentary type pastimes like playing computer games and of course television. I'll talk about the problems of television. And then at work, even just 10 years ago, we still used to get up and talk to our colleagues who are down the corridor. Now we can actually email our colleagues sitting right next to us rather than actually having to use our legs and get up and move around. And some occupations have changed substantially as well. I've used the example of the garbage or trash collectors. So this is how we put this or frame this, this whole concept of using the waking day. When we talk about the waking day, from the time a person wakes up to the time they go to sleep, if they sleep 8 hours, that's approximately 16 hours in the day to fill up with various activities. And this is a hypothetical figure, but what we've got, and as Joel mentioned about transportation, we've got a heavy reliance on passive transportation nowadays. We essentially are moving from chair to chair to chair throughout the day. The chair at the home, of course, I've highlighted in the workplace here, chair in transportation and going home again, and with our domestic setting, television is a predominant leisure time sedentary behaviour. But the important point to take away from this figure is that even if we've managed to find some part of our day to do what is considered to be the minimum amount of physical activity necessary to improve health. A lot of people use the term exercise for this. Even if we manage to get that 30 minutes of brisk walking, that still could leave potentially 15.5 hours in the day occupied by non-exercise behaviours. And I'm going to show you how much of that time is occupied by sitting. Key point. So when we talk about sedentary behaviours, we're slowly getting a grasp on what sort of a definition of sedentary behaviour. But when we actually look at the term sedere, it comes from the Latin word sedere, meaning to sit. And this encompasses all those different activities that involve sitting with low levels of energy expenditure. Now, it can occur across the workplace, the domestic setting, and also in transportation. And when I talk about it today, I supplement the term sitting time because essentially this is what characterises what all sedentary behaviours involve. So I'll use the term sitting time a lot throughout the presentation. And I think a key fundamental principle, I often get asked, so what's the physiology of all this? Why is sitting leading to all these conditions? And this, I use this figure a lot, and this comes from my good friend Mark Hamilton at the Pennington, where he published this figure in one of his review articles. Now, what this is showing is EMG tracing of the thigh muscle. Now, EMG is just measuring the electrical activity of the thigh muscle. Okay? And what he did is 4 different tasks. And you can see here, when he's stepping, the muscles have to contract. You can see here, when he steps, you get the contraction. And then when he stands up out of the chair, he gets that contraction. And even when he's standing, he's still got muscular activity going on. But the most striking thing in this is what's happening when we're sitting. In fact, I should say what's not happening when we're sitting. We've got total absence of muscular electrical activity, which translates to lack of muscle contraction. So even when we're up standing, we've still got muscular contraction going on. And I think, again, that's a key principle in this whole sitting argument. When we talk about the sedentary behaviour research, as I mentioned, we've been involved in this over the last 12 years. And one of our PhD students was kind enough to sort of graphically illustrate the rise in the number of publications that are taking place. Now, this is a year old now, but you can see that even over the last 3 or 4 years, we're starting to see a huge volume of literature coming out studying the health hazards of sedentary behaviour. In the early days, a lot of it was related to children, but we're starting to see a lot more in adults and older adults in the literature. We attempted to synthesise the evidence in this review article, and if you're interested in getting a contemporary perspective of the sitting time story, I direct you to this publication, where we took into account what all the observational evidence has told us, and then put our perspectives of what needs to happen from now on in terms of gaining the evidence base. And we use this traffic light type system, and I think this is so important for us in the scientific world, and not to put the foot on the accelerator and attempt to get to this point without crossing these road humps along the way. And we use the traffic light to indicate where we think that there's a rapidly strengthening evidence base, more compelling type evidence. The yellow is where there's a more modest evidence base, and red is where we need to do a lot more work. And I will use this throughout my presentation to illustrate where we are deficient and where we have substantial amount of information. So if we take the first one, I think that this is probably where we've got the most compelling, comprehensive evidence base, and that's identifying relationships of sitting time with health outcomes. Now, I could have put up a host of different studies, but I thought I'd use one from our group, which through this study called the OzDiab study. Now, this is a study of around about 11,000 Australian adults who we followed over a 6-year period. We followed the death rate over the 6-year period. Now, we used television viewing as our exposure here, and we looked at the relationship with all-cause mortality. And just to show you, this is compared to the people who are watching less than 2 hours of television per day. There's people who are watching 4 hours or more of television a day, and yes, there are people who watch 4 or more hours of television a day. This was associated with a 46% increased risk of death over that 6-year period. The other thing I want to point your attention to is, look at all the small print there. When you submit these to journal articles, you get asked, oh, you haven't adjusted for that, you haven't adjusted for that. We adjusted for nearly everything under the sun here. But I think the more important ones is the ones in the bold here. Even when you factor in a person's leisure time exercise levels and their waist circumference levels, this relationship still remained true, a 46% increased risk over that 6-year period. Now, I could have shown you other studies that have shown with total sitting time. A similar message exists. Last year, we published findings, published a review of the findings from studies that have looked at the longitudinal relationship. So when I talk about longitudinal, the value of these types of studies is that you have the measurement that's taken at time 1, and then you can follow your cohort over a period of time to time 2, and you can look at change that occurs over that period. So what longitudinal studies help us is get a bit closer to the cause and effect or causality nature of the relationship. Whereas when we just look at one point in time, here we're a little bit deficient. We can't establish cause and effect. One could be affecting the other. Now, this is a summary of that publication, and this is where I'm saying that we've got a fairly compelling evidence base here of showing relationships between sedentary behaviour. Now, the caveat here is many of these studies have used television viewing, not just total sitting time. But what we've seen is fairly consistent relationships between obesity risk, weight gain, diabetes, cancer, cardiovascular disease. And this is what I'm going to focus on a lot more today, is the relationship between sedentary behaviour and mortality in nearly all of the studies has shown that positive association. So we now have around about 11 studies that have shown that sitting time is associated with all-cause mortality. This study came out in, I think it was about May this year, and it is probably the largest study up with the cancer trials, which looked at sitting time and all-cause mortality in, now this is 220,000 Australian adults aged over 45. So a huge sample, and they followed the death rate over the 3-year period. And what they've used here is total sitting time, and you can see here that the risk increases substantially from 8 hours or more onwards. Again, coming back to this point, even when you factor or account for people's physical activity levels and their BMI levels, or the body mass index, you're still getting this increased risk at this end of the relationship. And one other important figure that they had in this paper, which I think illustrates this point of this being a distinct risk factor. And this is just in people who had cardiovascular disease and diabetes at the baseline. So they already had disease. And you can see here, what they did is they broke it down by the physical activity that the person undertook. And you've got here the increasing sitting time. And I just use these arrows to show you that, yes, of course, if you're not doing much physical activity and you're also sitting high amounts, you're at substantially increased risk. But even in the people that were exercising at this 300 minutes or more, that's an hour a day or more, they still, at this end, if they sat for 11 hours a day, they still had a substantially increased risk. And here, this is exactly around about where the national guidelines are. You can see that there's this blip here of at 11 hours, even in those that are exercising to the National Physical Activity Minimum Guidelines. So this is really highlighting that this is distinct. This is not the same as too little exercise. This is a problem of too much sitting. And this is so hot off the press that I had to include this morning in my presentation. It came out yesterday. It was in the British Medical Journal, and it's an analysis that was done by Peter Kaczmarczyk and Imin Lee, where they've looked at sedentary behaviour and life expectancy in the USA. Sorry about the quality of this. I just did a snapshot off this. But what I did is just highlight the key finding that they've found from this study, that the analysis indicate that population life expectancy in the USA would be 2 years higher if adults reduce their sitting time to less than 3 hours per day, and 1.38 years if they reduce their television viewing to less than 2 hours a day. It's very timely as we have this conference here today, and I'm sure it will have generated substantial media attention. So moving on to the next phase of the traffic light system, or the level of the evidence tree. I wanted to just talk about these two elements where I think that we're getting a little bit better, but we could strengthen this, and this is that moderate evidence based on measuring sitting time and characterising the prevalence in populations. We've made substantial gains in physical activity research through the use of activity monitors. And the most commonly used activity monitors are the accelerometer. The actigraph accelerometer is the one most frequently used. But for sitting time, the preferred measure is the inclinometer, or the active power measure. And what this measure does is it's worn on the thigh here, and it definitively tells whether a person is sitting or whether they're standing and moving around. The actigraph measures activity from the low-end levels of activity right up to the highly vigorous activity. And when we use it in our studies, we actually use these in combination, because one's deficient in the in measuring one aspect of the physical activity spectrum. In 2008, we actually published this study this was around about 200 Australian adults of our OzDiab study, and where Genevieve put the accelerometers on these individuals who range from 30 to 87 years. And this is the average, or the group average, for the time that they were wearing the accelerometer. Now, they had to wear it for 7 days, so we've got a fair spread. Couple of key points from this. Well, first point is that you can see what occupies the most in the day is sedentary time. This is that dark blue. And then next is the light intensity activity, exactly what I'm doing right now and what some of you are doing up there as you move around. But importantly, only 5% of the time that the accelerometer was worn was spent in these moderate and vigorous physical activities. Now, to remind you, this is the level of physical activity where we channel most of our public health efforts in trying to get people to exercise. We're ignoring then the 95% of the time. And I'm going to show you some key figures throughout my presentation, and I'll remind you at the end. But this is a substantial figure. When we talk about this issue, we're talking about 95% of the time. Okay? 95% of our time is spent in non-exercise behaviour. I'll remind you again that at the end. And just to show you that Australia is not alone in observing these relationships. In the US and also in Sweden, we're still getting around about that 60% of the time is spent in sedentary time, and a very small fraction of the time spent in moderate and vigorous physical activity. The other key insights that you can gain from using accelerometers is you can characterise people's physical activity patterns across hours in the day. And this has led to our notion of the active couch potato. A lot of people have a, oh gosh, that's me moment when I show this presentation, this slide. And what this is showing, this is the accelerometer counts throughout the 7-day period from morning down to night, and we've colour-coded. Dark is obviously the sedentary end, and the red is the exhaustive type exercise. And you can see that this is a person that is either doing their brisk walk in the morning or at lunchtime, or they're playing sport on the weekends, and they're actually making the minimum recommendation of 30 minutes a day. So they're physically active, if you think about it in national guidelines. But then when you look at the rest of the time, 70% of the time spent in sedentary time. So this person is physically active, but also highly sedentary, and we call this person the active couch potato. Just to give you some new data, this is data that is currently under review, where we used a convenience sample of workers that were from call centres, from typical office-based environment, and also retail staff. And we put accelerometers on around about 170 of these workers and just looked at their working hours. Okay, so we were able to denote the time that they spent at work. Here's the pie again. And it's not surprisingly that people don't do much moderate and vigorous physical activity in their workday. But what we're seeing is a substantial amount of the time is spent in sedentary time. Now, I did a little bit of back-of-the-envelope calculations on this, now, and this is not definitive, so there's the caveat on this. But if you start to do a bit of calculations, what this translates into is that this is per day here, but if you translate that into hours per week, that's around about 33 hours a week spent sitting. And if you put that into the year, that's about 67 full days of sitting. Put it out to the person's working life, that's potentially 8.6 years of sitting, if this applies. Again, here's another key a figure that I'll remind you at the end. This is 8.6 years potentially we could be sitting throughout our life. And this is where we need to make this impact in bringing that amount of time spent sitting at work substantially down. Well, I've talked a lot about the problems of too much sedentary time. There's another part of the story, and I acknowledge Genevieve, and you can see what she's working on in the background here. Genevieve was the person that really drove this concept of breaks in sedentary time hypothesis. Now, what she used is the accelerometer data to characterise people who broke up their sitting time versus the people who spent their sedentary time in prolonged bouts. And this is that frequent transitions, the breaking up. And what we have observed is that people who break up their sedentary time compared to people who the more prolonged sedentary time have better health indicators or risks of health. And I just illustrate, this is published in 2011, where Genevieve used the NHANES data from here in the US. And what she did is it broke it down in terms of how much time, how many breaks in sedentary time took place. With the people up here are the people who are breaking up more frequently compared to the people down here who are the prolongers. This is just waist circumference I'm using here. Just focus your attention on the green. You can see that as you break up your sedentary time, you have a lower waist circumference compared to those that are more prolongers. And this just summarises the other associations that we saw. Now, I should say this, that the breaks relationship here is irrespective of the total sedentary time. So even when you factor in people's total sedentary time, people who broke up their sedentary time had much better health profile than the people who are prolongers. So the story is, too much sitting is bad, but also how you accumulate your sitting is bad as well. In terms of if you're a prolonger, you've got increased risk. Moving on to the next part of our evidence tree, and I'm not going to spend a great deal of time here, but it really sets up for the remainder of the talk, and that is undertaking research to identify what are the determinants of sitting time. And this is a key figure that came from my colleague Neville Owen, and this is how we are thinking of the sedentary time story. And when we think about health behaviours, and I know Dr. Levine has published this in his review articles, we can't just focus on the individual. This is where this is our conventional comfort zone for explaining the causation. We have to think about what's the physical environment doing to this person's behaviour, and what's the policy context. So it's taking in this ecological type model in explaining health behaviours. And this is really what drives our workplace studies, looking at reduction in sedentary time, looking at all of these factors. This is what I wanted to spend the remainder of the talk on, is talking about the next major step in the evidence tree, and that's interventions or testing interventions to reduce sitting time, and does it lead to better health outcomes. And I'm pleased to say that in May this year we published findings from one of the first experimental trials where we actually conducted a laboratory-based experimental trial to take on Genevieve's concept of breaking up sedentary time and look at what benefits it had for postprandial glucose and insulin response. I'll talk a little bit about why it's so important to study postprandial, post-meal glucose responses. But the aim of this study was to examine the acute effects, now I'll talk about this as one day, of postprandial glucose and insulin levels of uninterrupted sitting compared to sitting interrupted by brief bouts of light intensity or moderate intensity walking. So we actually had some ambulation in this study. Why is it so important to study postprandial or post-meal glucose and lipids? Well, it's known that particularly postprandial glucose is an independent risk factor for future cardiovascular events. Why? Is because these exaggerated spikes in glucose and lipids that occur frequently throughout the day can lead to this oxidative stress and endothelial dysfunction, and ultimately leading to atherosclerosis or development of plaques. And when repeated multiple times throughout the day, this creates that environment that's highly conducive for risk factors, cardiovascular risk factors and cardiovascular disease. That's putting it in simple terms. And when you think about it, other than when we first wake up in the morning, we spend nearly all of our day in a postprandial state, continually eating throughout the day. So what we did, and I never thought I'd ever do these types of studies, being an exercise physiologist, I never thought I'd ever invite people to come and sit in our laboratory for 7 hours. And what we have done, and this is in 19 overweight adults aged between 45 and 65, we had them come into the laboratory, and for the first 2 hours, they came in fasted. We asked them to just sit. And the reason why we did that is because some might have caught a taxi, some might have walked from the train station. We wanted to get that steady state in the first 2 hours. Then we were so kind to them, we gave them this standardised mixed meal full of sugar and full of fat. And it's actually a drink. And the reason why we gave that is because we wanted to study how well the body responds to that challenge over the remaining 5 hours. So we took blood samples every hour throughout, and even in about 10 people, they were so kind to donate some muscle tissue and adipose tissue at the end so that we can start to understand some of the mechanisms. I'm not going to talk about that today, though. And just to show you, we had some very happy, friendly people that came in, and basically they sat in the laboratory and watched television, or they did a little bit of work while they were watching. And this is the ActivePal data. Yellow is sitting. So you can see we were pretty good in being able to get the person to sit for the 7 hours. The comparison was to other conditions. Now, they were both performed on separate days. They were a week apart, performed on separate days. And you can see why the key comparison here was they came in and they spent the 7 hours in the laboratory, but after that first 2 hour period, every 20 minutes we got them up off the chair, onto the treadmill, And in the first week, they just walked at a very light pace, just 3.2 kilometres per hour. I think it's equivalent to 2 miles per hour. On the next week that they came back, they actually increased the pace and they walked at moderate intensity. So we wanted to see whether there was a difference in light intensity versus moderate intensity in terms of the response. And initially, we started them walking at 6.4 kilometres per hour. But in some people, that was not tolerable. So we actually had to bring it down to 5.8. So I think we can safely say that they were walking at a moderate pace. And you can see here, this is just showing you, here's every 20 minutes, just for 2 minutes, and then they sat back down again. And the key findings that generated a lot of publicity from this study was the findings relating to glucose and insulin. And I'm just showing you here the findings for glucose. Now, just to walk you through this, we've got in the blue is the uninterrupted sitting, and then you've got the activity breaks. And you can see here, this is the steady state. Then we give the meal, and not surprisingly, it goes up, and then it slowly comes down over the 5-hour period. And you can see here that both the activity breaks lowered that response in the glucose over that 5-hour period. Now on the right, it summarises the total area under the curve, or the amount of glucose area under the curve here. You can see, and I summarise it here, both the activity conditions led to around about a 24% reduction in glucose levels over that 5-hour period. Now the key point from this is light and moderate yielded the same response. So it appears that it's the activity itself, not necessarily the intensity activity, that led to that change. So here's the other key number that I'll keep reminding you, is that this was breaks every 20 minutes in this. Okay, so I'll come back to these key numbers at the end. Moving forward, we were very fortunate in around about 2009, yes, that our Australian government published this report with a real preventative health focus. And inside this report, we were so pleased that they acknowledged that the workplace provides an ideal opportunity to engage individuals in health promotion. Just to summarise, they talked about taking more control of the health, but even inside this report, they suggested that simple interventions that can be implemented in the workplace and domestically to decrease passive sitting time and increase the number of breaks can also lead to substantial health benefits. We did have a little bit of a role in getting that into that document, but it really has set us up to start to work with the public health sector, or the public sector, in our studies that I'm going to show you. And we're really taking a different sort of approach to traditionally what the approach has been for health promotion involving physical activity in the workplace. And we're looking at through it with a different lens. And I just highlight here that in Australia we have our Work Health and Safety Bill, where we have this duty of care of a person conducting a business or undertaking must ensure, so far as reasonably practical, the provision and maintenance of a work environment without risks to health and safety. So that's the duty of care for the workers. But, of course, many things play a role here. We've got the organisational policy and the organisational culture. And then, of course, we've got individuals. And the traditional approach to physical activity is to provide individuals with, for instance, gymnasium memberships, physical activity type programs. So it's still heavily biased towards encouraging individual behaviour change. But it doesn't quite take into account that the workplace physical environment may also be contributing to the problem. And this is where we see that sedentary behaviour really crosses over all of these three considerations. A lot different to the physical activity type health promotion approach. So we have embarked, and we started this around about 3 or 4 years ago. We embarked on this program of research which we've called Stand Up Australia. And basically it's a program investigating the benefits of reducing sitting time in the workplace. Now there's a host of players. You can see that this is a collaboration between 4 institutions. And the key message, or the key approach, is we use this message of stand up, sit less, move more throughout all of our interventions. The impetus for a lot of the current work came from a review that we were commissioned by our health promotion group in our state. I've got a number of copies of this, not enough for everybody obviously, but I've got some copies where we synthesised the data of what sort of interventions had been undertaken in the workplace for reducing prolonged sitting time, and I can tell you there's not a lot of evidence in the literature. But one key aspect that we were able to conclude from this is that there are population groups that are at most risk of prolonged sitting in the work time, and these include, of course, working in offices, transportation, and the highly mechanised trades. Now, I've highlighted in the red our primary target in our current work. Okay? And there's a lot of people that work in offices. And we use this framework if our goal is to reduce prolonged sitting time. We can't just simply rely on individuals to make the change. The other pieces of the jigsaw are that what's happening at the organisational and policy type level, what's happening in terms of their workplace arrangements and their conditions, what's the workplace design like, and what are the social and cultural aspects. So we're really attempting to have this integrated approach to interventions in the workplace. So the Stand Up Australia program is dedicated to intervening on the problem, and when we talk about intervening, we're intervening at the environment level, the individual's environment level, the individual's behaviour, and also the organisational level. So these are the key change elements that we're focusing on. The other key element of our work is that we are seeking to use our expertise in objective measurement of sitting time, and that's why we use the inclinometers and the accelerometers. And we also have measures on health and productivity. Because we are a Heart and Diabetes Institute, we always like to know what is happening in terms of risk of diabetes and cardiovascular disease. So I'm going to just quickly show you some of the projects, one completed project and two that are currently ongoing. This is the Stand Up Australia work, and the first piece of work was an initial pilot that we undertook in Victoria, in Melbourne, with an organisation called Comcare, who is the organisational body or the agency responsible for the occupational health and safety of our federal government office workers. Okay? A key group to work with. And we undertook this initial pilot, as I mentioned. It was a 1-month pilot, and really the pilot was designed to inform the current main trial, which I'm going to talk a little bit about next. And what we did is we just used one site of Comcare where there was actually 2 floors of workers. They weren't they were randomised by floor. It's okay. So one group was the control group, and that was 1 floor. The other group was the intervention group. And I'm pleased to say that Ergotron was so kind in assisting us with facilitating this research by the provision of the workstations in this pilot intervention. To quickly walk through the design now, when I talk about the design, this is essentially the same design for the main trial that I will talk about. Basically, we have the 2 groups, the control or the comparison group and the intervention group. And in this study, it was a very short term where we just studied over 4-week intervention. In the first phase, as part of our approach to the organisational change, we engaged, we called it a consultation meeting. And what we did is we invited people who were responsible for occupational health and safety, people at management level, including CEO, the general staff, and to actually explain what the study was about and to get them to brainstorm about what types of initiatives could be feasible in their working environment. And what came out of this? A host of ideas, and I see that there's standing tips over there, but we've got a number of ideas that came out of this representatives' input. Some were good, some were not so good, But what we did is utilise these ideas and put them back to the workers. That was the next phase. So here's some examples talking about using a bigger glass of water, smaller glass of water so that you're going to the toilet more frequently. These are the sort of initiatives that they put in place. Then they created these maps. This is the Move More message. They created these maps of the local area and gave them certain times. If you had 15 minutes, you could do walk 1 and etc. And so what we did is we utilised that unit's representatives and then put it back to the participants in the study and say, okay, this is what your organisation has come up with. What are some of the elements that you would like to take on board in your intervention? And then, of course, for the intervention group, we had one of the workstations installed for each participant. Thereafter, in the remaining 4 weeks, we had firstly a face-to-face initial consultation, so we actually explained how to use the workstation, explained and set goals in terms of the face-to-face, so instructions, feedback, goal setting, and then what we wanted to do is establish a tracking mechanism. So how are you tracking over this 4-week period? So we used a tracking device, a log. And this is all to support behaviour change. Here's some of the example. We used the feedback that we had gained from the inclinometers to really inform the person's individual's behaviour change and their goals. And we used the ActiPal measure, and you can see here that green is the time spent moving, time standing is yellow, time spent sitting, and these are in bouts of less than 30 minutes, is in this red here. And then this is the catastrophic type zone, is time spent where sitting is accumulated in bouts of 30 minutes or more. Okay, so one of the key goals that we were focusing on is to reduce this amount of catastrophic time, the 24%. So we use these devices really to help inform the intervention. Again, what we did is we provided every individual at the first assessment with this sort of printout from the ActiPal. And you can see, it's just similar to what I showed you earlier. We've got a lot of red sections here. This is just in the work. This is not work days here. You can see also that there's not a lot of time spent standing throughout there. Just to reiterate, these are the key messages that have gone across the intervention across at the organisational level, the individual level. That is the messages of stand up, trying to encourage you standing up at least every 30 minutes. Sit less, of course, use the workstation to sit less, and then move more throughout the day. These are some of the key behaviour change strategies that were listed as people's personal favourites. In the stand-up message, that they use this mechanism of setting a timer, either online or through Outlook, etc. When the phone rang, you'll see these are some of the tips that are on the board over here. Stand up when someone else does, for instance, in meetings. And then you can see all the other behaviour change strategies for the sit less and move more message. And what you will see in some of the results is that we were more successful on these two elements than the move more message. Here's the results, and we're currently writing up this paper as a manuscript and submit it to a journal. And I'll just walk you through. This is the control group. And this over here is showing you at the start of the study, they were spending approximately 65% of their time sitting, 24 standing, and 10 moving. And you can see over that 1 month period, there was little change that occurred. And that's a good thing, because that's what the control group's supposed to do when you do these types of studies. But the most exciting finding was what occurred in the intervention group. You can see they're really similar when they first started, similar in terms of standing and sitting. But even over this 4-week period, we saw substantial change in the amount of time, so it's gone up to 47% time spent standing, and we've managed to see a reduction from 7% down to 42%. Now essentially this translates into a 2-hour per day reduction in sitting time. Conversely, that means a 2-hour per day increase in standing time over that 4-week period. Now the next challenge for us is to look at this over a longer period of time, and that's what the current main trial is looking at. But we're really encouraged by these findings. We did also look at changes in overall sitting time, so not just work time but also overall sitting time, and what this did translate into was a 76-minute reduction in total sitting time over the 4-week period. No change in the control. We did take measurements of glucose measurements, etc., but in this 4-week intervention there was no differences between the groups over that period of time, so no significant differences. We also took productivity type measures, and there was no difference between the two groups over this period of time. Thought I'd share this because what we believed, and just anecdotally, was that the workstations facilitated most of the standing throughout the working day. And some of the comments you've probably seen before, some you may not have seen. There were lots of positive comments, and particularly these comments were early on in the intervention. I like this one, improved concentration. But then there were some of the negative aspects. Now remember, this was using the early prototype of the Ergotron model, and a lot of the design features have, even in the last few months, have substantially improved the use of these devices. So many of these problems have been cancelled out. Our ComCare was proactive or very excited about the findings, and now are looking at incorporating standing workstations throughout their organisation. Kind of slowly getting there, but they've managed to put up this document on their website. Now I have an occupational health and safety perspective of the benefits of moving throughout. Very brief summary points, but getting across the key points. I have a couple of these that I'll leave. Finally, just to finish on 2 of the studies that we're currently recruiting. Now these are ongoing. They're what are keeping us busy. The Stand Up Australia project, the key project in this program is the program that is being undertaken in Victoria. It's called Stand Up Victoria project, which we were very fortunate to be funded by our national research agency and also our Victorian health promotion agency to conduct this study, and there's a host of investigators here. This is a 3-year trial, and it's a cluster randomised trial, meaning that we randomise by workplaces, okay, not by individuals, by workplaces, where our goal is to recruit 320 participants. 160 will be in the intervention group and 160 will be in the comparison group. We're aiming to recruit across 15 different work sites from the one organisation, and I'll describe what that is. And essentially what I described in the earlier pilot now will be just extended out to a 3-month intervention with a 9-month follow-up. So essentially, after 3 months, we will then back off, and then we'll follow people over the remaining 9 months. So essentially, they'll be utilising the workstations and the intervention over a 12-month period. The other important aspect is we've got an investigator who's interested or expertise in cost-effective analysis, and so we're collecting data to be able to undertake that type of analysis in this study. And we're very fortunate that our partner organisation, via tender, the successful tenderer was our Australian Government's Department of Human Services. Now these administer social welfare payments, including our Medicare and our Centrelink or social welfare. We're delighted to have this as these guys as a partner, and they've actually been so proactive in advancing this, in fact contributing a lot of in-kind support to the project, just showing you the interest that exists in this department, in this project. This was expected to finish at the end of 2013. So I can't present results today. We have around about 60 participants who have already been included. We've got a fair way to go. And we've actually purchased the workstations for this trial. I think we've got about 100 workstations that we'll be utilising in this trial. And they actually have the shelf this time. The other study, finally, to finish up on, and this is a study that is being undertaken out of Queensland, and this is undertaken by a very bright PhD student, Micah Newhouse, and this is utilising the WorkFit stations, again, kindly donated by Ergotron, in a similar type trial, but with a subtle difference to what I just showed you. What we're seeking to do is utilise the height adjustable workstations to see if it can effectively reduce workplace sitting time, but to evaluate the value of this additional individual and organisational support component, and whether it actually, if we can distinguish whether that leads to greater change in workplace sitting time. So there's 3 groups. Unfortunately, by nature of the organisation, we can't randomise. So there's 3 different groups from different work sites. But Group 1 gets just the workstations. Group 2 gets the workstations plus the individual support. So we're actually trying to distinguish what value this additional element has on here. And of course a control group. We're recruiting individuals from at the University of Queensland, so these are administrative type people at the university, and it goes across 3 different campuses. Now Micah has recruited all her people, around about 50 people, and they're currently in the intervention phase, and they should be finished their follow-up by early 2013, so February 2013. So again, that's a to be continued on that one. Now I know my time is nearly up, so I thought that I'd leave some take-home messages. Always important to leave some take-home messages from the presentation. And I think the key one is, and I don't need to preach this one because I know the group knows this, is we need to create opportunities within our waking hours to limit sitting time. And then the other key message is we need to avoid prolonged sitting periods. Break up sitting time on a regular basis. Use that terminology of stand up, sit less, move more often. And remember the key figures that I showed you throughout the presentation. 95% of our time is spent in non-exercise activity. If we sit for 75% in the day, that's essentially 8.6 years over a working life. But we can improve glucose metabolism at least by breaking it up every 20 minutes. Finally, to finish on a lighter note, within our physical activity conferences in Australia, we've introduced this new concept that at the end of a presentation, we encourage a standing ovation. Not only for the presenter's ego, but also maybe good for your health. Thank you so much for listening. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Dr. Dunstan. It was awesome. Wonderful. Incredible. I'll tell you what we're going to do now. We're going to actually have a question and answer session. So waving her hand frantically over there is Wendy. And if you have a question, because I'm sure you do, I'll even kick it off, please go queue up over there. As soon as we're done with the question and answer, then we'll have a short break. I've got some other details I'd like to go through as well. I see that you're standing. That's awesome. I love it. You're welcome to stand as long as you want. We're actually going to need, note for the next show, more standing tables. Remember that? My name is Eric, by the way, and I'm going to be running the stage for the rest of the day. So if you got any issues or anything, come see me. Let's cover a few incidentals for the event. The campus here, this lovely campus we're on, is a smoke-free campus. So unfortunately, you can't smoke anywhere on the campus. All right.
We do. Can you hear us?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. First of all, great talk. I really enjoyed it. One question is, on your study, your intervention where you tried to facilitate more movement, it didn't work. So can you speak a little bit about what your thoughts on that?
I don't know the definitive answer on that. Is this still? Yep. remember, this was a short four-week sort of study, so we're talking about a confined period of time. In terms of in the workplace, the nature, the arrangement of the workplace is not highly conducive to much movement throughout. It's a small environment. They did introduce the initiatives of the walking, which some took up, some didn't take up. But I guess the key messages that were picked up by most people were the stand up, sit less type messages throughout the day. And there may be some movement while they're standing, but it's not picked up by the devices.
Thanks. You're going to hold it? I'm curious about what you feel is a more significant contributing factor to the negative health outcomes. Is it the fact that inherently by sitting, we expend less energy throughout the day, and even if you were to work out, you could never make up for that energy that you lost while you were sitting during the day? Or is it because there are just basic chemical processes that when we are sitting from a physiological standpoint, like our body's ability to metabolize the lipoprotein lipase whole metabolic process. So is that a more significant contributing factor than just the basic lack of energy expenditure?
You put me on the spot there.
Yeah.
It's a very good question, and the answer is we don't know the answer just yet.
Okay.
But I'll carry my personal opinion.
Okay.
Is that I think we should be channeling all our effort on the energy expenditure aspect of this. I tried to illustrate that this is a situation where we've got muscular inactivity, absence of muscle contraction, and muscle contraction is just so important for many of the daily regulatory processes, particularly glucose transportation. And so I think the key message is that absence of muscle contraction. Remember, we've got 11 hours a day in some of the Australian adults. That's a large amount of time of absence of muscle contraction, which leads to what you were talking about, the types of mechanisms, the LPL mechanism. We've got to really understand this a lot more by doing mechanistic type studies, and that will lead to greater believability and acceptance in the general population.
Thank you.
Thanks for your question. That was great.
Hi. I wanted to ask if are there ways that you mentioned the 5 different ways that we have to influence change, individual being one of them. Is there a way for you to influence, have you designed a way in your research to influence the culture, or is there a way to measure the cultural influence? Or
That's one of the big challenges, and one that we found the hardest. And in the short period, it's quite difficult to change culture because that takes months, even years, to change cultures. But I've got to say, and I showed you some of the outcomes from Comcare, is that we're now starting to see them putting publications on there. So it appears that the organisation has grasped this. I've got to say that it's led largely by their CEO, who actually has a standing workstation.
Yeah.
But we can see that the shift in culture, a lot of people have the aha moment. It isn't that hard. And in the culture of that organisation, we saw shifts, but it's very hard to measure.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see when you have the 9 month of non-intervention and come back, if they all are sitting again.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks. Thank you.
How are you going to adjust your studies to move from correlational to causal?
I think I tried to illustrate that in the presentation where I used the traffic light sort of system, where we've got more compelling evidence based on the observational data. And now the very important next step that we're moving to is experimental and intervention trials. Now, in terms of evidence tree, that's where you get closer to the causal nature of these types of relationships. And I've already shown you some of the first insights from experimental research, which you can control for various factors, showing if you break up that sedentary time, you actually get that lowering of glucose response. So that's the start. I'm saying it's the start. We've just cracked it open. It's a big black hole, and we've only just scratched the surface.
Thank you. Any other questions?
The doctor will be available all day, so he will be here at the facility and be glad to speak with any of you on one-on-one basis, I'm sure. So let's give him a hand one more time.
Thanks, Eric.
All right, a couple more things here. We've got a lot of